This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Choiceology is a show about the psychology and economics behind the decisions we make every day and how to make better ones. I'm Dr. Katie Milkman. Join me as I share true stories from Nobel laureates, athletes, authors, and everyday people faced with monumental decisions. We'll share useful tools and strategies to help you make better decisions in your own life. You can find Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
Sign up to The Economist for in-depth curated expert analysis of world events and topics ranging from business and culture to science and technology. You'll get the weekly digital edition, online-only articles, curated newsletters on politics, the markets, science, culture, and China, and full access to The Economist Podcast Plus. The Economist is independent journalism for independent thinking. Go to economist.com and get your first month free.
It's the only court in the land, federal, state, or any other kind of court, that does not have a binding ethics code against it, and it shows.
Hi, and welcome back to Amicus, Slate's Supreme Court podcast about the court, the law, democracy, and in recent weeks on this show, about the very dubious history of the Supreme Court's love affair with originalism. There was some big legal news out of the High Court this week, but it was again overshadowed by some jaw-dropping reporting on judicial misconduct. On Thursday night, the New York Times' Jodi Kantor reported that in January of 2021, days after the attack on the United States Capitol, a cul-de-sac in Alexandria, Virginia, was roiled by whirring yard signs and flags. But this was not your average neighborhood battle. Nope. The house with the upside-down stars and stripes on its flagpole, broadly understood at the time to signal support for Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, flew on the lawn of Justice Samuel Alito. He told the New York Times this week it was because his wife. That there is no rule or law or code of conduct binding the justices notwithstanding, this week at 1 First Street did bring some good news for democracy. On Wednesday, the court, on its shadow docket, upheld a new congressional redistricting plan in Louisiana that will provide for a second majority black district. It was a 6-3 decision. The liberals dissented, likely because the decision is only going to be good for the coming election and leaves the door open for Louisiana to circle back and try gutting what's left of the Voting Rights Act on another day. So, good news being a relative term when it comes to this court, we will take what we can get. Also in the taking/getting category, a lopsided 7-2 decision in a long-awaited Consumer Financial Protection Bureau case that the court heard last October. The justices allowed the CFPB to continue to operate under its current funding structure, while the effort to hobble the CFPB was certainly emblematic of a Supreme Court term that features several challenges to the power of federal agencies. Justice Clarence Thomas, writing through the lens of history and tradition for the majority, found that while many arguments had been advanced for why the agency's funding mechanism was constitutionally unsound, quote, none is persuasive. Justices Alito and Gorsuch dissented, also writing through the lens of history and tradition. This is a big, big win for the Biden administration and for American consumers alike. At least it's not a loss. Again, we will take it. Later on in this show, we're going to bring you a really important conversation that I had on stage at our big live originalism show with Congressman Jamie Raskin. It happened at 6th and I this past week. We talked about Supreme Court reform, ethics, accountability, and originalism, but we also discussed the towering dangers of a monarchic Supreme Court. But before that, let's turn to Slate's jurisprudence editor, Jeremy Stahl, as we parse the 1-2 punch of the red tie brigade at the former president's criminal hush money trial in downtown Manhattan and the MAGA flag waving that happened at Justice Alito's house. So, Jeremy, Trump law correspondent, exhausted warrior, welcome back to the show.
I am really happy to be here with you, Dahlia, and have a break. It's nice to have a break from the courtroom.
You and Donald Trump. Hey, before we do anything, ask me about the Alito flag, please. Go ahead. Ask me.
So wait, so what happened? He's just waving it proudly upside down because that's what they do. So it's not a Trump flag. It's not a MAGA flag, but it's a backwards, upside down, reverse it flag. Is that constitutional? I don't know. Tell me, Dahlia, please.
I mean, the story's pretty bulletproof. Lots of neighbors corroborated. Court employees knew about this at the time. I guess query why it took so long to come to the pages of the New York Times. I guess the two things I just want to say really quickly about this story is just one, how freaking trivial and small this is. You know, it's very much like the Clarence Thomas RV scandal, where it's like, really, like you're going to like lash yourself to the mast. This is, you know, you are going to fight for your right to be in a Mean Girls fight with your neighbor about yard signs. Like, this is it. This is what you stand for. It's just so beyond the fact that it is unbecoming and that, you know, they're untruthful and they feel themselves to be unbound by the codes of conduct that say, you know, you don't evince this kind of partisanship. And everyone knows this. I clerked for a judge who wouldn't let us go to protests the year that we weren't allowed to have bumper stickers. We weren't allowed to, nothing. So, okay, let's say that I'm more recognizable as a law clerk than Justice Alito is as a justice. But notwithstanding the smallness, I guess the other thing that just really kills me is that nothing is going to happen. Like, this gets reported as, and so there are going to be demands that he step down from the January 6th case because he absolutely is compromised now. So what? He doesn't care. And I guess, you know, it is so absolutely the capstone to 3 weeks of talking about originalism and coming to the conclusion, as we did in the CFPB case, that originalism is what originalists say it is, that I guess Supreme Court judicial ethics are what Supreme Court justices say they are, i.e. just like a pile of dust and sand. It's unbelievably depressing that we continue to live this way. So that's my thought.
Does he or Clarence Thomas get to write the granting Donald Trump immunity forever decision? Which one of those two is the most qualified at this point? Both of them. Or does Ginni Thomas ghostwrite it? Who gets to write it? What happens?
I guess at least we know that their wives will go to the victory party that the Trumps hosts. So listen, Jeremy, since the start of the Manhattan trial on, you know, falsified documents and hush money payments, we have been describing these proceedings more as campaign event than jury trial, at least from outside the court, what we see. And this week, I guess in response to the gag order that came from Judge Merchan that prevents Donald Trump from insulting the jurors and insulting the judge and trashing the judge's daughter, we saw a steady stream of reality show contestants coming in to kiss the ring and then insult the jurors and insult the judge and insult the judge's daughter. Is this craziness that we are seeing, red ties included, having any impact at all in terms of you being in the courtroom? Is this affecting the proceedings?
I don't think the people recognize these guys and these women. I don't think the jurors know who the congresswoman from Staten Island is, or who Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor who wants to be vice president, I guess is, or who Byron Donalds, the Freedom Caucus rebellion leader in Congress is. I have no idea that it actually matters to anyone there. I mean, the judge might know. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, showed up in the courthouse and then did not show up in the courtroom. For reporters, it's this crazy scene that you're gawking at every single day, and it doesn't really affect the mechanics of how the work is being done, I don't think. And it's just weird because, like, on Thursday, there was this giant congressional delegation of like a dozen congressmen, like literally more than 10. And like, you know, Matt Gaetz was the leader. He got to sit next to Eric Trump because he's the coolest and he's the most close with the family or whatever. And the weird thing that happened was they have this row in the gallery that is meant for the defendant's side. And it got full because there was only 6-7 seats, whatever. And all these other like second tier congressmen, I guess, had to, or the people who were last in line, they had to go to the back of the courtroom by themselves, away from the Trump, Boris Epstein and the Trump, Alina Habba and all the Trump friends and family. And one of them had to sit totally on the prosecution. Imagine the shame. The prosecution side of the aisle, but he had unfortunately had Andrew Giuliani with him. I don't know which. It was really a backbencher, this congressperson who was back there with Andrew Giuliani talking shop with Rudy Giuliani's son on the prosecution side of the courtroom. But it's been so weird. And it's not just been that. There's been Fox News personalities that are there. I was sitting in court one day the last week, directly in front of Judge Jeanine Pirro, the Fox News personality, right? And that was the first day. It was so fun to see, fun and awful to see just how like excited the former president Donald Trump was to see his Fox News TV pals and buddies in the courtroom. He hadn't touched anybody in the gallery before. He had like waved and done some stuff. But I was dead staring at all of their encounters. And he came and he saw her and he had an enormous smile on his face and she smiled right back at him and he patted her on the shoulder, just, like a thank you for being here kind of thing. On the subsequent go round, he whispered to her, "Come meet me outside." He's more happy, I think, to have the Fox and Friends TV people than to have the ring kissing worshipers of the congressional world. Which is weird.
Do the jurors clock the Fox News personalities, or they just think it's more of his sons and sons-in-law and daughters-in-law and friends and family? Or are they like standing there being like, "Oh my God, it's Jeanine Pirro"?
I don't think so. I think like all they see is Eric Trump. Eric Trump is in there a lot. They possibly recognize Eric Trump, but everyone else is like mingled in the back, seated randomly. And the jury doesn't, for the most part, scan us that much. And also they're like CNN viewers. So if they are scanning us, they're looking for like Caitlin Collins or Anderson Cooper, who are also in the courtroom, like kind of weirdly. They're probably a bit more recognizable to the jury, I would imagine, than Judge Pirro or, Andrew Giuliani or whoever.
So I guess to the extent that there's a substantive question, it's whether they laid a glove on Michael Cohen on Thursday. And so I'm going to ask you the kind of two interrelated questions, which are one, just purely theater question. We've heard so much about Donald Trump's resting sleep face for the last couple of weeks, but can you talk a little bit about his demeanor when Cohen was testifying, and then just tell us if you think Michael Cohen's credibility was really undermined?
So Donald Trump has done the same thing every day, no matter who's testifying. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's Stormy Daniels. Doesn't matter if it's Michael Cohen. He's like, I don't know if he's meditating or like, my dark thought is that he's envisioning his revenge or something like that, like while he's sitting there closing his eyes, like, because he is like deeply out of it, right? He says he's listening. I'll believe that he might be listening because he's talking to his lawyers occasionally, passing notes about that was really bad or getting really angry at certain things. In terms of the second substantive question, yes, they did finally make a dent in the prosecution's case on one particular point. Todd Blanche was doing cross-examination of Michael Cohen, who is sort of the centerpiece of this case. He's the one who effectuated the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels through her lawyer, Keith Davidson. He's the one who Trump is accused of falsifying documents by signing all these $35,000 checks to Michael Cohen that were listed as a legal retainer for some maybe 10 hours of legal work that he did over the course of 2017, he says, for a total of $420,000. But we're actually all part of this reimbursement scheme to pay back for the Stormy Daniels hush money payment, right? So Michael Cohen is key. He's a central player. He's an incredibly problematic witness because of his past perjury, his past lies, his past bullying on behalf of Donald Trump. And so they didn't really save the best for last because Michael Cohen will be the last witness that the prosecution puts on. But they tried to put their strongest witnesses first and have Cohen come in at the end, sort of reversal of what it would be as this corroborating force, this person who could fill in the blanks and tell the story that had already been told, answer the blank spots, and, tell the rest of the story. Okay, so during prosecution's direct questioning, they asked him about a series of phone calls that he had right when the hush money payment was being made, end of October, days before the presidential election, which they allege is part of this campaign finance crime to stop the voters from having the Stormy Daniels story, right? As he was going to the bank and filling out the forms to get his loans transferred to an account to pay Keith Davidson, to pay Stormy Daniels. He says, I was on the phone regularly with Donald Trump, either Donald Trump personally or through his body man, Keith Schiller. Okay? This is the end of October 24th, 26th, 28th, when the series of bank documents were signed and ultimately finalized. One call, one 1 minute and 30-second call happened on October 24th. And during direct examination, Michael Cohen said, I made this call to Keith Schiller, Trump's body man, specifically to talk to Trump about how I was about to finalize the Stormy Daniels deal. So this was the verification and validation from the boss, go through with the deal. So it's a not unimportant call. He had calls directly with Trump 2 days later, a day after that. So over this entire time, he's talking at length with Donald Trump on Donald Trump's personal phone. But there's this one call with Keith Schiller that he says was the call where he verified go ahead with the deal. Todd Blanche very dramatically on Thursday pulled out a series of text messages between Michael Cohen and Keith Schiller that the prosecution did not show. And what they showed was right before he made this call, Michael Cohen had identified a harassing, potentially 14-year-old kid who had been harassing him on the phone, calling him up, prank calling him basically, identified a crank caller. He said to the crank caller over text, you should notify your parents. I'm notifying the Secret Service. And then he texted Keith Schiller and said, I want to tell you about something. I need to talk about this crank caller, and we need to get this dealt with the Secret Service. And then they had that central critical 1 minute and a half phone call that he says Keith Schiller handed him the phone to Donald Trump and said, go ahead with the Stormy deal, right? So it was highly dramatic. Todd Blanche was he had a meal of it, and he should have, because it was their one really, really good moment where it was like, was this really a minute and a half call for this purpose that you said it was, that was central to accepting Donald Trump's orders on Stormy Daniels, or was it this other thing that was going on? So he was very proud of himself. It was the most like my cousin Vinny moment of them all, for sure. And afterwards, when I was outside of the courthouse, like a few blocks away from the courthouse, chatting with another reporter about the performance, I see Blanche, who I've never spoken with in my life, and his team giddily smiling, happy as clams, walking down the other side of the street. And I shouted at him, hey, Todd, we're talking about you. We're discussing how things went. And he runs across the street. He's so eager. He wants to hear. He runs across the street. How are they saying it went? How are they saying it went? And I tell him what I heard. I tell him, people are saying it's a good right hook. It's not a knockout. It's not a Perry Mason moment that completely obliterates the case. And he goes dismissively, so you've been talking to Norm Eisen. And I had been talking to Norm, who's a great legal analyst and a friend, but also comes from a perspective. He starts to run back across the other side of the street. I say, wait, there's one more thing. Another veteran journalist had told me, you know what? That might be worse than people in this room are taking it. Because I had a lot of conversations that are saying this isn't so bad. And there might be some confirmation bias among this particular group, members of the press, who are just not really appreciating the potency of something like that and the dent in the credibility of all of Michael Cohen's interactions that puts, right? I yelled him to come back over. He sort of half came over, and I told him the confirmation bias thing. And he said, I agree with that. And he ran away before I could ask him any questions. He was clearly happy about his performance. So his boss must have been happy about his performance. But I don't know the answer to the question of whether it actually ends the case, because there's so many other phone calls. There's so many other conversations where they did this thing. It's not just that one.
I'm only laughing because Jeremy Stahl said the word people are saying, which is like the most Trumpy thing. You've been in that room trapped with the former president for too long. People are saying.
It's seeping into my brain. Well, I knew that would get Blanche on the line, right? If he wants to hear what people are saying. And so does his boss.
I feel that I speak on behalf of every single person on the planet when I ask you the following question. When does this end? When is it over? Can you give us the timing? It sounds as though if Cohen's done and the defense is not calling anyone, when does this thing wrap? And I largely am asking for barbecue/vacation planning purposes. But yeah, can you just tell me how this plays out next week?
That's it. That's the barbecue, like vacation plan that the judge, the prosecution team, that if they don't know how to figure this out, they have Wednesday off. They have Friday off because of a juror's Memorial Day travel plans. They tried to get the jurors to come in and work Wednesday. They couldn't do it or wouldn't do it, whatever. So they have 3 days this week to wrap things up. Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Monday, Michael Cohen's testimony is going to end. He's the last prosecution witness. Defense has been very cagey about whether or not they're going to put anybody on. Maybe a rebuttal witness, probably not to Michael Cohen. Maybe an expert witness, probably not about campaigns. And then maybe Donald Trump, right? They want to hold this possibility that Donald Trump comes in Monday or Tuesday to testify, which seems unlikely. So then you have end of Monday and Tuesday and Thursday really do closing arguments, instruct the jurors, and have them start deliberating into a 4-day weekend. So defense team doesn't want that. They don't want, the defendants don't want jurors deliberating with barbecues and beer and, hot dogs on their mind. The judge certainly doesn't. He said so. He said so on Thursday that he always did his best to try to prevent long breaks of a jury deliberation period, and also long breaks between closing and jury instructions. So he doesn't want to allow closing arguments to happen on Thursday and then have the jurors come back on Monday and do jury. It's like a very hard problem to resolve, but I guess the upshot is it's ending. It's this week or next, and then there will be a verdict. I had been pretty 50-50 hung jury conviction and no likelihood of acquittal. And after that one non-Perry Mason moment on Thursday, where this one phone call really got a dent in it, and like all this other beating up of Michael Cohen that was done, I'm a little bit thinking maybe the likelihood of a hung jury has gone up. Maybe there's a teensy chance of an acquittal at this point, but it's coming. It's coming soon.
Jeremy Stahl, Law of Trump, trademark, correspondent for Slate. Visions of hot dogs dance in our heads. Thank you so much for, my God, hardship, hazard duty. I don't know how you are doing it, but the fact that you get to see the who's who of the Fox News C team, I'm a little jealous. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Dahlia.
We are taking a quick break to hear from our sponsors. When we come back, Congressman Jamie Raskin at our live show in Washington, D.C. on the Supreme Court's ethics problems, doctrine problems, originalism problems, and how we push back.
This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. I'm Dr. Katie Milkman, a behavioral scientist and professor at the Wharton School, and the author of the best-selling book, How to Change. You may have heard expressions like, time to get up and going, today's bad decisions aren't going to make themselves, or bad decisions make good stories. But really, no one wants to suffer the consequences of making a bad choice. Join me as I share true stories from sports heroes, Nobel laureates, and everyday people faced with monumental decisions. We'll discuss the latest research in behavioral science and dive into themes like whether we can learn to make smarter decisions and how powerful it can be to get a do-over. And we'll share useful tools and strategies to help you make better choices in your own life. You can find Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
This episode is supported by FX's Clipped, the scandalous story of the 2014 Clippers owner's racist remarks captured on tape and heard around the world. The series charts the tape's impact on a dysfunctional basketball organization striving to win against their reputation as the most cursed team in the league. Starring Lawrence Fishburne, Jackie Weaver, Cleopatra Coleman, and Ed O'Neill. FX's Clipped, streaming June 4th, only on Hulu.
And now we head to that hideous place, reeling still from Justice Clarence Thomas's one-star Yelp review, by which I mean Washington, D.C., the entire city, where we gathered with Slate Plus members, Amicus listeners, and some of the smartest people I know to cap off our originalism project. Over the last couple of weeks, in podcasts and pieces at slate.com/originalism, we've reached the understanding that originalism is not, in fact, originalist, and that even if it were, it's killing people. On stage at 6th and I, in front of a live audience this past week, Representative Jamie Raskin, constitutional scholar, and Fuego historian and frequent dragon slayer in the world post-January 6th, joined us to discuss whether the Supreme Court plans to drown us all in the shallow waters of bad history and what we can do to fight back. We taped this conversation before the Alito family MAGA flag story broke, but I think what struck me most in listening back to it is how little this story changes what Raskin had to say about ethics and Supreme Court reform. What was true remains true. Several Supreme Court justices feel completely unbound from ethics because they are, in fact, completely unbound from ethics. Let's head now to that live show with Representative Jamie Raskin. Representative Raskin is going to be familiar to every single one of you for his work on January 6th accountability. Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. He is a lawyer. He's a constitutional law professor. In short, Representative Jamie Raskin is the perfect cherry on top guest for this final lap around originalism and the Supreme Court and the future of American democracy. Welcome.
Dahlia, it's a thrill to be with you. And I know we've been trying to do this for a long time, and it seems like either impeachment or an insurrection or a coup or something kept getting in the way.
There's always something.
There's always something.
I want to start by saying I've always thought about you as one of the very few bridge people in Congress. And you connect so deftly, I think, the abstractions of the law and the Constitution to the abstraction that is democracy itself. And then you connect all that to a public that has just largely been taught that this stuff is too technical for them to care about or too sacred for them to intervene in. So our entire originalism series was born of a need to make this thing that is originalism, this thing that is the Supreme Court and a 6-3 supermajority, transparent. It was really conceived of as a way to say to people, holy cow, care about this thing. And you've been doing that for a very long time. And so I would love to hear you just tell me your thumbnail answer to how do you explain to voters that the Supreme Court is the single most urgent thing that they don't quite know how to care about?
Well, one way to do it is to look at like what the Democrats are campaigning for in this campaign. We want to try to repair the damage inflicted on the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, where the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance mechanism. We're trying to restore women's reproductive freedom in America by passing a federal law that would codify Roe versus Wade. I can give you a whole bunch of examples like that, but the point is we're basically trying to repair the damage that's been wrought upon us by the Supreme Court. And if we win Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate and we defend the White House against nihilism and authoritarianism, and we succeed in doing that, all of it, and we pass the laws we're talking about, all of it could still be taken away by the Supreme Court. Take Roe versus Wade. If we say we're going to use our powers under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to codify Roe versus Wade, to just restore a woman's right to choose in consultation with her physician within the first trimester and subject to reasonable regulation in the second trimester, the Supreme Court might just say, Congress does not have the power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It is not congruent and proportional to the underlying constitutional right, which we just eviscerated in the Dobbs decision. And they could do the exact same thing in our attempt to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They could simply say, you might think that you're enforcing and vindicating an existing constitutional right, but you're not. You're expanding that right because we've already devoured it in Shelby County versus Holder. So the Supreme Court is right at the center, and they will use the rhetoric and the methodology of originalism when it suits them to undo a right they don't believe in or to establish a government of power that they want. But if originalism doesn't work, they will choose another methodological technique to get to where they want to go. So I guess the way that I explain it to people is fall out of love with the Supreme Court quickly, okay? Because if you look at American history, for the vast majority of our history, the Supreme Court has been a profoundly conservative and reactionary institution. All the way from the founding to the Civil War, what did the Supreme Court ever do for enslaved people in this country? Nothing, other than in the Dred Scott decision, cement into place the system of slavery and say that the African and the descendants of Africans have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And they used, at that point, that was an originalist interpretation, mostly saying if you look at the original statutes in most of the states, the African Americans had no rights, and therefore they could not have any rights. There were dissenting opinions that were strong opinions. Even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, what did the Supreme Court do other than gut the meaning of those amendments, and in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, essentially uphold American apartheid, Jim Crow apartheid? And it was not until the 1950s, until the Warren Court, where we got decisions like the white primary line of authority and Brown versus Board and Gideon versus Wainwright, and then eventually Roe versus Wade. There was about a 2-decade period that created the halo around the Supreme Court. And then it immediately went away again with the Burger Court and the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court. So the Supreme Court is not going to save us, my friends. We're going to have to do that, which is why I just got back from Texas and New Hampshire. I'm all over the country. It's going to take a popular upsurge in America to win our rights back. Yeah.
So one of the big complaints this year for listeners to Amicus, for people who think deeply about the rule of law, is this question of whether the machinery of the law, as currently constituted, is adequate and fast enough to hold Donald Trump accountable. And we are now seeing 3 of the 4 criminal cases being dragged out, sometimes as a result of legal arcana and technicalities and who the judge is. And we're seeing at this moment Donald Trump sitting in a courtroom in New York, and he's either going to be held to account for unlawful hush money payments to influence an election, or he's not. So what do you tell people who feel that, dude, I was all in for the law, but the strictures and the protections of the legal system have gone from holding Donald Trump accountable to keeping him off the hook? Can law keep up with the creeping, now speeding forces of, as you said, nihilism, illiberalism, authoritarianism, or is law lacing up its sneakers while those things lap us again and again?
I mean, the law has got to exist in our hearts and our minds. And I might be the closest that you find to somebody who's a real originalist, because the way I see it is that if you read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments the way I do, the vast majority of the amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights, the vast majority of those 17 have been democratizing amendments, suffrage extending, equality deepening amendments, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process against the states. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of the U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise in America by giving women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment gives people in D.C. the right to participate, at least in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment bans poll taxes and removes wealth as a barrier to participation. And the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. The whole trajectory of our constitutional growth has been towards greater democracy and greater inclusion. But that is not an original understanding that the vast majority of the people at the Supreme Court will accept. And they do not give you an original interpretation, an original understanding of the Equal Protection Clause, which occasioned a revolution in our jurisprudence. So, but I guess my answer to your question, my honest answer is I was shocked, even as jaded as I've become about the Supreme Court, I was shocked at what they did in Anderson versus Trump. The plain language of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that anyone who has sworn an oath to support the Constitution of the United States who violates the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. It's in the plain language. And that's textualism, right? You know, there's a difference between textualism and originalism. Textualism says we can figure it out from the language itself. But if you have to take an extra step and go to an originalist analysis, do it, because you will find that Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans who brought Section 3 of the 14th Amendment came in with a far broader proposal over on the House side. What they said was, anybody who's engaged in insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to vote again. Anybody, not just former elected officials. It got over to the Senate and they said, whoa, that goes real far. You're talking about disenfranchising millions of people for life for participating in the Confederate insurrection or another future rebellion. We want to zero in on the most culpable class of offenders. So what's the bullseye? People who've sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, who violate the oath by engaging in insurrection and rebellion, and even those people will not be disenfranchised. You still have the essential attribute of citizenship, which is the right to vote. You can just never hold office again. And that's what the Colorado Supreme Court found after 5 days of fact-finding. And the justices, because they thought it would be too controversial, just threw their hands up and said, oh no, the states can't do that, and Congress has got to do it. Oh, and by the way, it's not a political question. It's not really up to Congress. Send it back to us to make sure that, you know, we run it through the straitjacket of our Federalist Society analysis. I mean, come on, you know. And then you turn on TV and you get all these conservative pundits saying, well, why should he be the only person in America who can't run for president? Really? Because there are 75 million people, I bet there's some of them in this room, raise your hand if you're one of them, who can't run because you're not 35 years old. Anybody out there? How about anybody born in another country who's a U.S. citizen now? You can't run for office either. How about you've already done 2 terms in office like President Obama? You can't run. There's more than 100 million people who can't run for president in the United States. And if you think about all of those categories of disqualification for serving as president, the one that is most morally, legally, and politically defensible, although they're all in the Constitution, so they're all part of the law, the one that is the most defensible is you've chosen to set yourself at war against the Constitution itself. There's like 5 or 6 people in that category. So call me at least a 14th Amendment originalist, because that's what I am. And I will say, because I was so thrilled to get your invitation, and I started thinking a little bit more about your topic, which is so fascinating. You know, on the Second Amendment, for example, in the Heller decision, which is a D.C. case, which overturned D.C.'s ban on handguns, that was not an originalist analysis at all. It had nothing to do with the original intent and so on. But then when you get to the Bruen case, you know, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, well, they want to look at the history of what kinds of laws existed at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment. They don't want to look at what kinds of guns were in existence at the time the Second Amendment was written, because at that point, the only gun you'd be allowed to hold under the new magical individual right you have under their jurisprudence is the flintstock musket, okay? But they're not stuck in history there, but they do want us to be stuck in history when it comes to what kinds of laws are allowed. So if there's a law saying that a domestic violence perpetrator can't have a gun, they want to say, well, were there any laws like that back in the 18th century? Well, what do you think? You know, and so they turn it on and they turn it off like air conditioning, you know?
I'm hearing your answer to my, is law adequate to the task of holding Trump accountable? I'm hearing your answer to be, well, yeah, if the Supreme Court lets them, you know, it really does turn on what the Supreme Court says about holding Trump accountable. And you make this, I think, essential point that those of us who looked at, Anderson, the Colorado case, and the Trump immunity cases, and we stroked our chins and said there's going to be a grand bargain, right? Trump will lose, on immunity, and he'll win on Colorado, but it's all going to come out in the wash because the court really cares about Donald Trump and protecting democracy.
Yeah.
And the really chilling thing for those of us who told ourselves a story about the court caring, both about its sort of reputational interest as a serious entity, but also caring that there be free and fair elections after 2024, court doesn't seem to care. And I would love for you to give us a sense of, we certainly on this show told people we can make the court care. We're going to just be super angry, and we're going to demand ethics reform, and we're going to write angry letters. And at some point, they will feel shame. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm asking is, please tell us we are not just beholden to a court that does not seem to care, manifestly so in the last few weeks, about the future of constitutional democracy.
You want me to tell you that?
I want you to tell me that the court cares.
I mean, I never thought I would live to see the day where justices have their own billionaire sugar daddies who give them, houses and automobiles and private school tuitions. And my friend Dar Williams sings a song where she says it's a long road from law to justice, And it is a long road from law to justice. And, again, look, I was a law professor for 25 years. People come up to me in the street and they say, wait a second, you were a tenured professor of constitutional law and you went down there to work with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. But I left for a reason, which is I fell out of love with the ideal of trying to make it work. I think it's great that people do it. I'm totally into your work and the Alliance for Justice and People for the American Way and NAACP Legal Defense Fund. More power to them. These are my allies. But to my mind, we got to organize the people in America. That's where the power comes from. And we will, if and when we win back the House and the Senate and the White House, we will look at the Supreme Court and figure out what can be done about that extremely corrupted and contaminated body. So the Constitution, of course, does not fix the numerical composition of the Supreme Court, and it has changed 9 or 10 different times over the course of our history. We have 13 federal circuits. We've got 9 justices. 5 of those justices are from New York. We've got 1 for each borough, okay? We have entire federal circuits that don't have a single justice. How about we start to talk about having 13 justices on the Supreme Court, 1 from each circuit, 18-year terms. They still get life tenure because they can go and be on the district bench or the circuit bench. Each president gets 2 appointments to the court, 2 nominations to the court. Guaranteed nominations. Obviously, the Senate still has to advise and consent, but it will remove some of the toxicity and the poison from the nominations if we know that each president will get 2, and we can deal with this problem. But the current Supreme Court is just a scandal. It's just a scandal.
We're going to pause now to hear from some of our sponsors. When we come back, more from Congressman Raskin, the constitutional Energizer Bunny of the House Democrats.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Ever combine an ice-cold frozen Coke with piping hot fries? Try frozen drinks any size for $1.49. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
So I'm hearing you say, shame is not going to get us there. We're going to need to reform the court. And it's cute to think that they're going to get embarrassed.
I tried your shame strategy, Dahlia Lithwick, after Bush versus Gore, and I wrote a book called Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People, and about how it was just a full frontal assault on constitutional text, on methodology, history, spirit, structure of the Constitution, the right of the people to choose their own president, all of the precedents and so on. And, it didn't shame them.
No. It was, however, an excellent book that I enjoyed very much.
I appreciate that.
So here's the thing that I really want you to answer, because I think nobody knows about what Donald Trump's legal advisors are planning to do if he wins office. And they're not secretive about it. This runs the gamut from the horrors of Project 2025 to the Comstock Act to gutting core democratic functions, to gutting government as we know it, the Justice Department unrecognizable, prosecuting enemies of the people. I mean, this stuff is Orwellian, chilling shit. Sorry, people under presidential age, cover your ears. This is very, very bad. And so I would love for you to tell us how to make tangible for people who care about law and the rule of law what is coming, and that voting because Trump is sleepier than Biden or Biden is sleepier than Trump is a pretty narrow frame for the stakes of this election.
Yeah, I mean, everything's on the ballot. Democracy's on the ballot. Freedom's on the ballot. Our whole constitutional framework. Sometimes my colleagues will say to me, I had a colleague from South Carolina, a guy I liked named Trey Gowdy. I don't know if you remember him, but on his way out, he said, Raskin, you're not a bad guy. The problem with you is you're a liberal. And I said, well, you're damn right I'm a liberal. The heart of the word is liberty, and I'm a progressive because the heart of that word is progress. But my favorite thing to call myself these days is a conservative, because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the climate system, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so everything is on the ballot. And so I think you've got one party, which is a party that's standing up for democracy and civilization, and another party which wants to tear everything down. And look, Donald Trump already pardoned Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Dinesh D'Souza. I mean, I could keep going for a dozen of them. That's the inner coterie of his presidential campaign. And he's running around the country saying that he will pardon the January 6th hostages. Now, a hostage is someone who has been illegally abducted by a terrorist or criminal enterprise like Hamas and held for a legal or a political ransom. The people he's talking about, there are 29 of them in D.C. jail where they go to protest for their freedom. Those 29 people are in jail for having been found guilty or having pled guilty in most of the cases to violently assaulting Capitol officers or Metropolitan Police Department officers with steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, and they're also there, some of them, for the crime of seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States. So he wants to now go and pardon the political shock troops who came and attacked our police officers as part of his most recent coup and insurrection, where they tried to get Vice President Pence to step outside of his assigned constitutional, ceremonial, ministerial role under the 12th Amendment to the Constitution to oversee the counting of the Electoral College votes, and simply to proclaim Donald Trump the president or to reject and return enough electoral college votes from Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona to declare that there was a failure of a majority in the electoral college, and then to kick the whole thing over into so-called contingent election under the 12th Amendment, where they knew we would be voting not on the basis of one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And the GOP controlled 27 state delegations. We had 22. Pennsylvania was tied 9-9, so they would have been just written off immediately. Even had the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, voted with us or voted for someone else, they still would have had 26 states. And that was the big Green Bay sweep that they were planning to nullify enough electoral college votes with this fraudulent return to the states mechanism. But then they knew under the 12th Amendment, immediately we would have to resolve into the House in order to vote. So that's what they wanted to do. Then you've got Donald Trump's lawyers running around saying he's got absolute immunity from any charges relating to a violent insurrection that he ginned up in order to support his inside coup. And they say, well, upon questioning in the DC Circuit, they say, well, maybe it's not absolute. If you can first impeach and convict him for it, then he could be tried later. They actually answered the question, yes, the president could order assassination of his political rivals because he might be impeached and convicted, to which I immediately thought, having been our lead manager in the second impeachment, I said, gee, wouldn't that give that president who just assassinated all of his political rivals an incentive to assassinate us, the people who might vote to impeach or convict him? Because then if he stops there from being a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which has never been assembled, or if he stops himself from being impeached in the House in the first place, then he could never be prosecuted. And so they're literally making an argument for assassination and slaughter of people in the federal government. And this is where we are in 2024.
That took a turn.
Yeah.
Wasn't quite buckled in for that one. Representative Raskin, I feel like I have to ask you briefly about Clarence Thomas, because we have not fully aired in this evening's festivities the utter weirdness of having such a completely closed system that nobody who litigates a January 6th case at the Supreme Court can stand at the lectern and say, oh, by the way, that guy, he should not be here. We're in such a strange world in which this is just sort of taken for granted, both by the public and the press, and there's nothing to be done, and then he asks questions. And I guess part of your answer to this is ethics reform, right? What you said before, we can fix these problems. But are we so far through the looking glass that we just accede to this monarchic court that tells us to trust them, that they're not compromised? Yes.
Well, I mean...
And there it is.
I mean, it's the only federal court in the land that does not have a binding ethics code against it. It's the only court in the land, federal, state, or any other kind of court that does not have a binding ethics code against it. And it shows, right? If you don't have an ethics code, you get people flying on junkets with their billionaire buddies all over the world and taking, huge cash payments for a motor coach, a house, a private school tuition. Why not? You only make, $325,000 a year? $325,000 a year, right? Is that what it is? It's like double what we make. Pay for your own damn vacation is what I want to say, My God. So, let's go back to the beginning. Madison did say that it is a principal element of our jurisprudence that no one should be a judge in his own cause, in his own case, right? And the Supreme Court, they're all judges in their own case. Who decides whether there's a conflict of interest? They do. And not even as to each other, each for him or herself, right? At the very least, why don't we create an ethics committee of the chief judges of all the federal circuit courts of appeal, and we could apply to them if we think there's a conflict of interest in the Supreme Court. Does that make some sense? I mean, could we make that happen? But if you also go back to the beginning, the court was not so elevated in people's esteem. And I mean, I concede it's come down a lot because these people have disgraced the institution so much. But I think we were getting to a point where people really thought, there was something different about them. And, one would like to think it's true. There were certain justices, who did create that kind of image and idea, Justices Marshall and Brennan and Brandeis, but in general, though, I mean, it has been just a sordid and miserable reactionary lot. I mean, the Dred Scott decision, alas, was authored by a Marylander, which is a bummer. I'm not going to utter, look, we just need like a massive democratic renewal in America, and we're going to get all these fantastic young people across the country engaged in our politics, getting elected to state legislatures and the councils and the school boards and Congress and the Senate, and we're going to get new people going out as judges, and we will have a renewal when we get through this very dark authoritarian period in our life.
Yeah, I think we can clap for renewal. We only have a quick minute left, but I did promise the audience that we would end a kind of grim 2 weeks talking about being pinned under the dead hand of originalism and the dead hand of a 6-3 supermajority. And you've talked several times about what it would mean to have we, the people, reclaim the project of constitutional democracy and interpretation. Can you just tell me what that looks like?
I mean, I had Professor Tribe in constitutional law, and there I found both my career and my wife. I met Sarah there, and I used to go and gaze at her across the lecture hall like here, and I thought she was looking at me, but she apparently didn't have her contact lenses on. I learned at the end of the semester. But anyway, but Tribe taught us that in a Supreme Court decision, and I think this was kind of standard con law pedagogy, that you begin with the text, the language of the Constitution, and then you look at its history, meaning its legislative history, and what were the purposes embodied in what we can determine from the constitutional history. And then we look at the subsequent cases and how they interpreted the history and the language and what we can learn from that. And you look at the ethos or the spirit of the document, and you look at the structure of the document. You can look at something called intertextualism, which is how similar ideas or words are interpreted in other parts of the Constitution. But it was very clear from what he was saying that it wasn't like there was a clear hierarchy necessarily. It wasn't like a how to set up your dishwasher kind of guide, like if you just followed one step to the other. Why? Because the whole process is saturated with value. It's saturated with ethics and morality and politics, which then give a particular perspective to everything, to the language, to the history, to the structure, to the spirit, and to the ethos. And this was before, originalism really hit its heyday, and that was the idea, when the right wing thought they were going to be a lot closer to where people were in 1787, that they wanted to try to hit rewind all the way back to then. They don't do that. They never did it for, 1868, and they didn't do it for the Reconstruction amendments. They didn't want to go to that period, so they used other devices to get there. All of which is to say, all of us are human beings. None of these justices are superhuman, to say the least. But there are political, moral, ethical, social movements in American history that infuse the law, infuse the legislatures and Congress, infuse the presidency, and infuse the courts. And it's our job to create the movements that will put the Supreme Court back on the side of freedom and equality and justice in the people.
Sticks the landing every time. Congressman Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, a veteran constitutional law professor, and according to Axios, one of the busiest men in D.C. I also just want to, on a personal note, to say how glad I am that you are well and busy and thriving.
Thank you, Dahlia.
Slate Plus members, you are going to have early access to the final installment of our How Originalism Ate the Law live panel recorded at 6 and I this week, including some of the questions you, awesome Plus listeners, submitted to us before the show. If you are not a Slate Plus member and you want to listen to a really rousing conversation about what we can actually do about a Supreme Court that's all in, but when it suits, on several flavors of originalism, do click Try Free at the top of our show page if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, or you can go to slate.com/Amicus Plus to sign up. And that is a wrap for this episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your letters and your questions. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can always find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer with help from Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We'll be back with another episode of Amicus next week. Until then, hang on in there.
Owning a business isn't just an occupation, it's a legacy for those you want to pass it on to. At Sandy Spring Trust, succession planning is one of the many aspects of wealth services we provide. We'll work with you one-on-one to answer questions and advise you on valuations, transfer of ownership, and much more. What's your next financial destination? Visit sandyspringbank.com/wealth. Wealth and insurance products are not FDIC insured, not guaranteed, and may lose value. Wealth products offered by Sandy Spring Trust, a division of Sandy Spring Bank.